The Spire raid was supposed to be a clean job. That's what the briefing said. 11 pages of tactical language about a religious compound in the upper residential stacks, a cult operating without civic registration, suspected weapons cache, suspected coercion of minors. The Eye of God Brotherhood. That was their name for themselves. Though we called them the Blink Boys in the precinct. On account of the giant painted eyeball they slapped on everything they owned. Standard doomsday operation. The kind that fills the upper stacks every few years. When enough frightened people decide that the dome is going to crack, and the end is coming. And they'd better give their savings to someone who speaks with conviction. I'd done 9 of them in 12 years. Ren had done maybe 14. We weren't expecting anything we hadn't seen before. The city we lived in had a name on the civic registry. New Lodek, but nobody called it that. We called it the Pit, or the Bowl, or just the city, depending on how tired you were. It sat 300 meters below the surface in a carved-out basin of reinforced concrete and pressure glass, and over it arched the dome. 2 kilometers of layered atmospheric shielding, the inner surface perpetually fogged with moisture, and the faint luminescent pink of the UV filtration panels, cycling through their 12-hour artificial day. The surface above us was gone. Had been gone for a long time. A nuclear plant on the eastern coast of what used to be a country called Japan had gone wrong, and then the solar flares had come, and between them, the two had stripped the topsoil of anything living. The government had moved everyone underground. That was the official story, and it was mostly true, as far as it went. What the official story didn't mention was the Watchers. They'd arrived about 40 years before I was born, which put it roughly concurrent with the surface becoming uninhabitable. Draw your own conclusions. Most people in the city had drawn theirs, which was one reason the Eye of God Brotherhood could recruit. The Watchers were not hostile exactly. They didn't attack. They didn't conquer. They appeared in orbit, in 17 enormous vessels, shaped like the vertebrae of something ancient and vast, and within 6 months, they had established what they called a stewardship accord with the surviving governmental bodies. Exchange for continued habitation of the underground cities. Humanity would submit to periodic environmental assessment, population cataloging, and what the accord termed species preservation protocols, which in practice meant that a small number of pale, elongated beings with 4-jointed arms and no visible facial features beyond a horizontal slot they used for both breathing and communication would occasionally descend to the city in sealed transport pods, walk through public areas with scanning instruments, and file reports that went nowhere we could read. The Watchers were not cruel, they were something worse. Hurt, indifferent, with the particular quality of indifference that comes from 10,000 years of managing lesser species. They had a word for us in their own language that the translators rendered as residents, but which the xenolinguists at the university said more precisely meant something like the ones currently occupying the monitored space. Not citizens, not people, residents. The kind of word you'd use for bacteria in a petri dish if bacteria had a word for themselves, and you wanted to be technically accurate without being complimentary. I thought about them sometimes on night shifts, walking the upper stacks, not with fear, just with the particular tiredness of a man who knows the shape of the cage he's in and has stopped expecting the door to open. The Spire raid launched at 0200 city time. We went in fast. 3 transport sleds through the upper stack maintenance corridors. Ren's team on the east face, my squad on the west, Commander Arette holding the exit routes below. The Spire was a converted residential tower, 40 stories. The lower 30 given over to ordinary citizens, who mostly didn't know what was happening in the upper 10. The Brotherhood had barricaded the top floors with scavenged plating and strung the stairwells with tripwire alarms. They'd also armed their inner circle with military surplus pulse weapons, which was the part of the briefing that made 9 raids feel like experience instead of routine. We lost Gorvin on the 34th floor. Flashbang from a doorway. 3 cultists with weapons. Gorvin took 2 rounds in the chest before the squad cleared the room. He was alive when we carried him to the stairwell. I don't know if he stayed that way. I had 17 floors left to clear and a job to do. And grief in this line of work is something you put in a drawer and deal with on your own time. Top floor of the spire was a cathedral. They'd knocked out the walls between 8 apartments to make a single long nave, hung the ceilings with chains of red glass that caught the glow from the city lights coming through the windows, and painted every surface with the Brotherhood's eye symbol. That enormous, unblinking, pupilless eye, done in white and black, covering walls and floors and ceiling in repeating patterns until the room felt like it was watching you from every direction simultaneously. At the far end, on a raised platform, was their altar. The cultists on this floor didn't fight. They were kneeling, heads down, hands clasped, about 30 of them, the kind of surrender that isn't really surrender but theater. They wanted to be arrested, wanted the attention, wanted the trial. I left 3 officers to manage the kneeling elf and pushed through a side door in the altar wall. What was behind it wasn't on the briefing. A smaller room, used to be a bedroom. You could still see the outline of the closet behind the Brotherhood's painted eye. And in the center of it, suspended from the ceiling by 4 chains attached to cuffs around her wrists, was a girl. She was young. Hard to say exactly. The wings complicated the read on age, made everything about her seem older and more weathered than the face suggested, which was the face of someone no older than 20. The wings were real. I stood there for 3 full seconds processing that, because when you see something that your entire life has told you cannot exist, there is a lag between the eye and the brain, a moment where the world just stutters. They were large. Each wing folded had a span from her shoulder to somewhere past her knee, white feathered, the primary feathers long and slightly iridescent in the red light from the chains. They hung slack from her back. She hung slack from the chains. Cuffs had abraded her wrists, and there was dried blood tracking down both her forearms. Her eyes were open. She looked at me, without expression, as if she had been looked at by people carrying weapons for long enough that she had stopped expecting it to mean anything, either way. Ren came through the door behind me. He looked at her for 2 seconds and said quietly, "Well, that was Ren." He had an economy of reaction to things that I'd always admired. Where I processed, he filed and moved on. We got her down. Ren took the cuffs off. The Brotherhood had used standard security restraints, not their own manufacture, which told you something about where their weapons had come from. And I caught her when her arms came free, because she didn't have the strength to hold herself up. She was light, or she seemed light. I think the wings redistributed weight in some way I didn't understand. She didn't speak. I held a water canteen to her mouth, and she drank a little, carefully, as if she wasn't sure the offer was real. Ren was already on the comm reporting to Arret. I heard him describing what we'd found, in the flat, careful language, no editorializing, the kind of report that sounds like nothing until you replay it and notice what's in it. The Watcher team arrived 11 minutes later. I've thought about that timing a great deal since. 11 minutes from our comm report to the dome access point to the transport pod descending to the spire roof. That is not 11 minutes of bureaucratic processing. That is 11 minutes of a response that was already queued. The Watchers knew about the girl. They had probably known she was in the spire. They had been waiting for someone to find her. There were 4 of them. The Watchers don't have ranks the way we do. Or if they do, they don't make them visible. But there is always one that speaks and 3 that scan. And the one that speaks carries itself with a particular quality of settled authority that makes clear it is not consulting anything or anyone before it makes decisions. This one was taller than the others, its 4-jointed arms folded at an unusual angle, its gray-white skin catching the red light from the chains, and not being changed by it, as if the color simply declined to apply. It looked at the girl. Then it looked at me, not at my face, exactly, but in my general direction, the way you'd look at a piece of fur that had been moved slightly from where you expected it. It said in the flat synthetic voice of the translation caller, "The specimen is under stewardship jurisdiction. Please step aside." I said, "She's a person." There was a pause. I learned later that Watcher pauses are not hesitation. They don't hesitate. They simply sometimes wait for their translation systems to determine whether a human utterance is worth responding to. Classification is not within your authority to assign, it said. Step aside. The 3 scanning watchers were already moving past me. One of them produced a sterile container. Sealed, transparent, about the size of a large equipment locker. And they were assembling it with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this many times on many worlds. The girl watched them work. Expression didn't change, which I think was not because she didn't understand, but because she did. Put his hand on my arm, not pulling, just placing, the gesture that means, not here, not now, we lose this here. I stepped aside. They put her in the container. It sealed with a pneumatic click. One of the scanners lifted it without apparent difficulty, and they moved toward the door. The tall one paused at the threshold. Your report will note that the specimen was secured by stewardship personnel upon discovery, it said. This is the accurate version of events. It didn't wait for an answer. They were gone. Ren and I stood in the empty room, with the chains still hanging from the ceiling, and the Brotherhood's eye watching us from every wall. And I looked at the abrasions on the floor, where the container had been dragged, and I thought, she drank from the canteen. She was careful about it. She wasn't sure the offer was real. We're not done with this, I said. Ren looked at the chains. No, he said, we're not. That was the beginning. The middle part, the weeks that followed. I'll compress, because it was the kind of time that feels very long when you're inside it, and very short when you try to describe it, because nothing in it changed anything, and stories that go nowhere compress down to almost nothing in the retelling. File a report with the Civic Administration. The report was flagged, reviewed, and returned, with a notation that matters relating to stewardship jurisdiction were not within the Civic Administration's purview to adjudicate. We filed a request for information on the girl's current location and status through the official Stewardship Liaison Office. The Liaison Office returned a form letter confirming that no information on active stewardship protocols could be shared with civilian or law enforcement entities. Ren submitted a formal inquiry to the Stewardship Accord Review Board, a body that technically existed for exactly this purpose, resolving disputes between human institutions and Watcher Authority, and waited 31 days for a response, which arrived as a 3-line letter explaining that the review board was not currently constituted for sessions and inquiries would be processed in the order received. I went to see our precinct commander, a careful man named Oster, who had 29 years on the force, and a talent for delivering bad news in language so precise and measured that you understood exactly what he was telling you, and felt almost nothing. He told me that the Stewardship Accord superseded domestic law enforcement authority in classifies as species preservation, that 2 enforcement officers pursuing extra-jurisdictional action against a Watcher stewardship protocol would be unlikely to retain their positions regardless of outcome, and that he was officially recording this conversation as a welfare check and not an operational briefing, which was his way of telling me he had heard nothing and intended to continue hearing nothing. Then, he looked at me for a moment with the flat, tired eyes of a man who had been in the cage long enough to stop testing the bars and said quietly, "Whatever you're thinking about, Dav, think harder." That was as close as anyone official got to helping us. We went back to work. We did our jobs. We worked the stack beats and filed our reports, and went home and came back and did it again. The city continued to be the city. The dome filtered the light. The panels cycled through their artificial days. The residents went about their business. In the 300 meters between the surface of the Earth and the place where the Earth had become poisonous. The neon's signs in the commercial stacks ran their advertisements in rotating 8-hour cycles. Transit system ran on schedule except when it didn't. The Eye of God Brotherhood's surviving members were processed through the civic court system, and variously charged and assigned community service hours, working the water reclamation system on level 40, which they accepted without apparent irony. Gorvin, I found out on day 3, had survived. He was in a recovery ward, in the medical levels, with 2 broken ribs and a punctured lung, and a very long wait before he'd be cleared to return to duty. But he was breathing under his own power, which was what mattered. I thought about the girl every day. Not obsessively. I want to be clear about that, because I've known men who let something lodge in them and grew wrong from it. And this wasn't that. Shh. It was more like the way you think about a door you passed that you should have gone through. Thing you didn't resolve that sits quietly at the edge of everything else. The chains in that room, the blood on her wrists, the canteen. I found out where they were keeping her on day 19, not through official channels. Through a records clerk in the infrastructure division named Sophie, who had been tracking the stewardship transport logs since the accord was signed. Because she was the kind of person who tracked things nobody told her to track, on the theory that someone should. Sophie was somewhere in her late 40s, thin, with the slightly too alert eyes of someone who had been reading between lines for so long that the lines themselves had started to seem beside the point. She worked in a records sub-office 2 levels below the main infrastructure division hub, in a section that handled archival data requests for systems that had been taken offline or transferred to Watcher stewardship control. Infrastructure that the city once owned and no longer quite did. She had, over the 11 years she'd been in that position, assembled an extraordinarily complete picture of the Watcher facility network beneath the city. Not by breaking any rules technically, just by reading every request, cross-referencing every log, and maintaining her own separate index that nobody had authorized and nobody had told her to stop keeping. She found me, or found Ren, and Ren told me. She had seen the Spire raid report. It was publicly filed, stripped of most specifics, and she had cross-referenced the Watcher transport activity that night and identified the pod that had left the Spire's roof and where it had gone. She didn't know about the girl, specifically. She just knew that the transport log had a notation she'd never seen before. Priority biological cargo, non-human classification pending review. The girl was in a stewardship environmental facility on the 47th sublevel, a section of the underground infrastructure that the Watchers had claimed as a monitoring station early in the Accord period, and which human personnel were not permitted to enter. The facility was designated in Watcher transit logs as a preservation archive. The kind of language that sounds like care if you don't think about what it means. Sophie had more than the location. She had 11 years of incidental surveillance. Nothing deliberate, nothing invasive. Just the accumulated record of a person paying attention to a thing that nobody else was paying attention to. She knew the facility's general layout from infrastructure access records. She knew the scanning protocols from cross-referencing the Watcher maintenance request logs with the city's own infrastructure maintenance schedules, which is the kind of information that sounds useless until you need it, and then turns out to be the only reason you succeed. She knew the facility's personnel rotation schedule from transit pod usage patterns. She knew where the monitoring was and where it wasn't, because the places where the Watchers had never filed a maintenance request were the places their systems didn't reach. She gave us all of it. She didn't ask why, and we didn't explain, and she didn't come to us looking for thanks, she said. The scanning instruments on the vehicle access corridor have a 3-minute reset cycle after any external interference event. I'd want to know that in your position. Then she stood up and went back to her desk and her index, and her 11 years of paying attention to things she wasn't told to pay attention to. And Ren and I walked out of her sub-office and didn't talk until we were 3 levels up and certain we weren't being tracked. I sat with all of it for a few days. Then I called Ren. He came over on a rest day morning, sat at my kitchen table, drank the coffee I made him, and listened while I told him what Sophie had found. He didn't ask me why I'd kept looking. He knew why. He also knew, I think, what I was working toward. Because when I finished, he put his mug down and said, "Tell me about the route." There are things about Ren, I should say, because he matters to what happened and he deserves to be described accurately. He was 10 years older than me, which put him somewhere past 50, and he'd been on the stack beats for 22 years. He was not a large man. Medium height, slightly hunched from years of moving through corridors, built for ceiling heights that the infrastructure engineers had optimized for cost rather than comfort, with close-cut gray hair and a face that gave nothing away as a matter of professional practice. He had a daughter in the secondary schools in the lower residential stacks. He had a small apartment and a dying spider plant on the windowsill that he refused to throw out, because he said it was doing its best given the circumstances, and he respected that. He was the best officer I'd ever worked with, which is not the same thing as the most impressive or the most decorated. He was the best because he never did anything for the wrong reason, and he never stopped when the right reason was still there. The route. The 47th sublevel was accessible through Infrastructure Division maintenance tunnels from the decommissioned vehicle yard on Level 12, Sector 9. The yard held a collection of retired municipal equipment, old utility haulers, drainage pumps, electrical repair vehicles that the city hadn't yet processed for salvage because the salvage allocation was backlogged, as everything in the city's operational maintenance was perpetually backlogged. The Watcher scanning protocols covered all personnel entry points to the 47th sublevel. They did not cover vehicle access through the decommissioned yard, because the decommissioned yard was, as far as the Watcher scanners were concerned, inert infrastructure, not a point of entry, not a security consideration, just old machines in a dead space. That was the part that mattered. The Watchers had been managing species habitats for 10,000 years. In 10,000 years, you develop protocols for everything you've seen before. You do not develop protocols for things you have not imagined. The Watchers had never imagined, apparently, that two tired cops in a dead city would decide to drive a decommissioned garbage truck through a maintenance tunnel into a restricted research facility. Because in 10,000 years of species management, no cataloged resident of a managed habitat had done anything so structurally pointless. We had 4 days before Wren's next rotation to the upper stacks. We used 3 of them to prepare and kept the 4th in reserve. The hauler was an old Type 7 utility vehicle, orange, battered, the size of a city bus but lower slung, built for navigating the substack maintenance corridors. It ran on the city's electrical grid and had been decommissioned because one of its axle motors had failed. Wren fixed the axle motor. He had been a vehicle mechanic before he joined the Enforcement Corps, and he approached the repair with the same unhurried competence he brought to everything. Working in the decommissioned yard over 2 evenings while I watched the access logs and kept anyone from wandering in with a clipboard and questions. Evening. I watched him work under the raised chassis with a lamp on his forehead and a manual spread flat on the concrete, and I thought about how a man can carry his whole life's worth of skills, and the world only ever asks him to use the last ones he learned. On the second evening, he got the motor turning, and we listened to it run, and Wren said simply, "That's it." In the same tone he used to close out incident reports. We made 3 dry runs through the maintenance access route on foot during off-peak hours, timing the transit pod cycles and verifying Sophie's assessment of the corridor monitoring gaps. The Watcher facility's scanning instruments had, as she'd noted, a 3-minute preset cycle after each trace external interference, a fact that had never mattered before, because there had never been anything in the decommissioned yard to interfere with them, and the interference we were planning was the hauler's electric motor, producing a low-frequency EMF signature at close range. Test this without triggering whatever secondary alert it might produce. We had Sophie's word for it, and our own knowledge of how the city's older electrical systems interacted with the Watcher instruments, which was knowledge accumulated from years of working in a city where those two systems had never been designed to coexist and mostly managed it through mutual indifference. We brought extra water. We brought a thermal layer each for the cold of the archive. We brought a pry bar, 2 of them, and a hand torch and Sophie's printed schematics. Shh. We brought nothing that could be traced to our names. Nothing that was registered in any system we didn't control. Nothing that would look like anything other than maintenance equipment in the back of a maintenance vehicle that was logged as not operational and could not, according to every record in the Infrastructure Division's database, possibly be moving. The vehicle's scanning profile was registered in the Infrastructure Division's system as Hauler Unit 79er, decommissioned, non-operational. That registration had not been updated in 11 years. It would appear, to any systems cross-referencing it, as a vehicle that did not move and had not moved since it was retired. We did not change this registration. The Watcher facility, on the 47th sublevel, had 4 entry points, all of them actively monitored by Watcher security instruments. that operated on principles we didn't fully understand, but that we knew detected biological signatures. Heartbeats, body temperature, the chemical signature of human respiration. They did not, Sophie had established, scan vehicle interiors unless the vehicle was flagged as an active security concern. A decommissioned hauler in a dead yard was not a security concern. A decommissioned hauler with 2 officers and a bolt cutter inside it, driving through a maintenance tunnel at 0300 on a Wednesday, was still not a security concern because the scanners were not looking for it. I want to be clear about something. We were not brave. I mean that seriously. Bravery implies you've weighed the danger and proceeded anyway. And bravery is usually in service of some calculation about outcome versus risk. What Ren and I did was simpler and I think less impressive than bravery. We had run out of other options. And the alternative to doing this was doing nothing. And doing nothing meant leaving her in a preservation archive on the 47th sub-level where she would be cataloged and studied and administered to, and where every day would be the same as every other day, until she stopped being useful to study, tried every available door, and found them all locked, and at some point you stop looking for a door, and you look for a wall thin enough to go through. The hauler's electric motor was nearly silent at low speed. We moved it out of the decommissioned yard at 0247, through the level 12 maintenance approach, and into the access tunnel that ran toward the deep infrastructure at 0301. The tunnel was wide enough for the vehicle by about 40 centimeters on each side. The walls were exposed conduit and old pressure pipe, lit by widely spaced amber maintenance lights that cast everything in a color, somewhere between yellow and brown. Ren drove. I sat in the cargo bay with the equipment and tried not to think about watcher security responses and how fast they were, given that 11 minutes from a radio call to the spire roof had felt fast enough. The tunnel had its own sound. Not the motor, which was close to quiet, but the sound of the vehicle's frame transmitting the small irregularities of the tunnel floor. The joints in the poured concrete, the places where the infrastructure had settled slightly over decades of the city's weight pressing down on it. A low, continuous conversation between the hauler and the ground. In the amber light, with the walls closed on both sides and the conduit and pipe running overhead in dense parallel lines, you lost any sense of the city above you. The dome, the civic cavity, the residential stacks with their millions of people in their small apartments doing their ordinary evening things. Down here was just the tunnel and the motor and the grid of amber lights stretching ahead until the curve of the passage took them away. I had done the math on what happened if this went wrong. The math was not good. It didn't change anything about whether we were going, but I'd done it because it seemed important to have done it deliberately rather than to have avoided doing it. 2 suspension-eligible offenses on the record minimum. Criminal charges possible under the Civil Security Code. Potential accord violation proceedings that could run for years in the review system that was never constituted for sessions. Career ended, pension complicated. Daughter's secondary school fees not jeopardized, but the conversation you'd have to have with her considerably harder. We were going anyway. I'd done the math on that too. What I thought about instead was the water canteen. She'd been careful about it. Wasn't sure the offer was real, and she'd drunk from it anyway. That was the part I kept coming back to. She'd been chained in that room long enough that her wrists had bled and dried and bled again. Long enough that she'd learned not to expect anything from the people who came through the door, and when someone offered her water, she had still carefully chosen to try it. That's not nothing. That's a person making a decision. That's someone who has not yet decided the world is finished. I had the facility schematics Sophie had reconstructed from the infrastructure records, printed on paper, because I didn't want them on any network-connected device. Preservation Archive was 3 levels deeper than the vehicle access corridor. We'd need to go on foot through the utility access shafts, which the schematics showed as unmonitored, because they were too small for normal personnel transit, and the Watcher's habitat management philosophy apparently did not account for the possibility that the habitat's residents might be small enough to fit. We were. The access shafts were exactly as unpleasant as the word shaft implies. Horizontal, not vertical. though narrow enough in places that I had to turn sideways and inch along with my back against one wall and my chest nearly touching the other. The air was old and tasted of recycled filtration. I followed Ben's feet in the amber glow of his handheld light and tried to keep my breathing, even in my mind, on the schematic. The Preservation Archive's outer wall was composite paneling over structural concrete. The Watcher's standard construction in the facility, identifiable by the faint iridescent sheen the paneling had under direct light. There was a service access panel in the wall of the shaft where it ran alongside the archive's eastern boundary. The panel was secured with a proprietary Watcher fastener, which was not something we had a tool for. We had a pry bar. Pry bar worked. The room inside was cold. The Watchers kept their preservation archives at lower temperatures than human habitation, not dangerously cold for short-term exposure, but the kind of cold that makes everything feel clinical and considered, as if the temperature itself has been calibrated. The lighting was a pale blue-white, steady and uniform, without shadows. There were no corners in the room in the human sense. The walls curved into the ceiling in a continuous radius, a design principle that I had seen in other Watcher-constructed spaces, and that always produced the same effect of making the room feel like the inside of a container rather than a building, like something you were stored in rather than somewhere you stood. The room held 12 transparent containment units, each about the size of the one we'd seen assembled in the spire. Most of them were empty. Just the pale interior lighting and the slight mist of the refrigerated air inside. The atmosphere the Watchers considered appropriate for whatever might eventually occupy them. Two held what looked like samples of surface vegetation, carefully preserved. One a section of something that resembled grass, brown and desiccated, mounted in the unit like a specimen in a museum display, and the other a tangle of something that had been a bush once, its branches dead but intact, the leaves still attached in the cold, preserved as they had been at the moment of collection. The surface above us in microcosm arranged behind glass for study. One unit held an animal I didn't recognize, quadruped, about the size of a small dog, with a lean, angular build and a coat that had been some shade of brown or tawny in life, and was now a slightly faded version of that, standing motionless in a way that made me think it was sedated rather than dead. There was a tag mounted on the unit's frame with Watcher notation I couldn't read. Some creature from the surface. Collected. Catalogued. Preserved in a cold room for study, the same way they had collected and catalogued the girl. I looked at the animal for a moment, and then I stopped looking at it, because there was nothing useful in looking at it, and the girl was at the far end of the room. She was in the unit nearest the temperature regulation equipment, which hummed with a sound just below the level you'd consciously hear but present enough to feel in your chest. The steady, indifferent operations of systems that maintained their conditions, whether they contained anything or not. She was lying down. She was dressed in a single-piece garment I didn't recognize. Watcher issue, probably, made of some material that had no particular texture, pale gray. Her wings were folded against her back. Her eyes were closed. The abrasions on her wrists had been cleaned and dressed, which was something. They hadn't been completely indifferent to her physical condition. They had treated the wounds their containment had caused, which was the kind of care that isn't really care but maintenance. You keep the specimen viable, you address the damage, you ensure the conditions are stable, because the study is ongoing, and a deteriorating specimen is a loss of data. As I stood there for a moment and looked at her in the cold blue light and thought about 12 to 18% surface viability, about models and protocols and ongoing assessments, about the gap between knowing something and understanding it. There was a locking mechanism on the containment unit that operated on the same principle as the service panel. Pry bar worked on this too, though it took longer and was louder than I would have liked. Ren kept watch on the service panel while I worked. The locking system resisted, and then it gave, and there was a hiss of pressure equalization, and the front panel of the unit swung outward. The temperature change woke her, or something did. Maybe the sound, maybe some instinct. She opened her eyes and looked at me, and I saw the same thing I'd seen in the spire. The flat, careful, not yet decided look of someone who has learned that people with purposes arrive, and that the purpose is rarely for them. I said quietly, We're going. You have to come with us. She looked at me. She said, I'm the one with the water canteen. Something changed in her face. Not a smile. Not quite. More the look of someone who has been presented with a fact that doesn't fit the model they've been working from, and is deciding whether to revise the model. She sat up. The wings adjusted automatically as she moved, shifting for balance in a way that seemed involuntary, like the way a person's arms come up when they're startled. She swung her legs over the edge of the unit and looked at the floor with an expression that was almost practical, assessing the distance, the surface, the question of whether she could stand. She could stand. She was unsteady, and Ren was at her side before I'd finished closing the containment panel, one hand offered, without insistence, available if she needed it. She looked at the hand for a moment, and then took it, and they moved toward the service panel together, while I followed and tried to remember if there were any Watcher personnel scheduled for the archive in the hours before the morning cycle. The shaft was harder going with 3 people, especially the third person having wings that, even folded, added significantly to her width at the shoulders. She managed it without complaint. She didn't speak. I didn't know yet if she could, but she moved with all kind of deliberate, unhurried competence that made me think she had been in small spaces under duress before and had learned to treat them as problems rather than disasters. We made it back to the hauler without incident. I want to tell you that part was easy, and for 7 minutes it was. See, Ren in the driver's seat, me in the cargo bay with her, the Type 7's motor humming quietly through the maintenance tunnel at 15 kilometers per hour, the amber lights sliding past. She sat against the far wall of the cargo bay with her wings folded tight and her knees pulled up, and she watched me with an expression that was slowly, incrementally, becoming something other than pure wariness. I offered her the water canteen. She drank from it without hesitation this time. I took that as progress. Then the tunnel lighting changed. Not off, just different, a shift in frequency that turned the amber to something whiter, harsher, and in the same moment, the hauler's electrical system flickered and Ren said from the cab, in a voice calibrated to be heard but not to alarm, "They know." The Watcher security response, when it came from above, or rather from a level of the infrastructure we hadn't planned for. The tunnel network at level 12 connects to the primary maintenance arteries at 3 points, and one of those points was 80 meters ahead of us. That junction came 2 Watcher security units, not the observer types, not the 4-jointed pale figures with translation collars, but the security variant, broader, darker in color, moving with the swift mechanical certainty of systems that had been designed for exactly this contingency and had waited patiently to be deployed. They were not armed, exactly. Watcher security didn't use projectile or energy weapons in enclosed spaces with infrastructure they wanted to keep intact, but they carried restraint instruments, and they moved to block the tunnel with the unhurried confidence of things that knew the math of the situation and had already solved it. Ren didn't slow down. I have thought many times about what I would have done in his position. He could see them. He knew what they were. He also knew that the hauler weighed 8 tons and was moving at 15 kilometers per hour, and that Watcher security units were designed for habitat management, not vehicle interdiction. He hadn't done the math out loud. He had just, at some point in the preceding days of preparation, apparently looked at the situation and decided that the answer to security units in a tunnel was a large vehicle driven by someone who did not intend to stop. The impact was significant and not as bad as it could have been. The security units were built for durability. They weren't destroyed, just displaced. One of them slammed into the tunnel wall with a crash that rang through the vehicle's frame, and the other clipped by the hauler's front corner and spun into the conduit piping. The hauler shuddered but kept it moving. I was thrown against the cargo bay wall, caught myself, checked on the girl. She was pressed flat against her wall, wings spread instinctively for balance, eyes wide, the wariness completely replaced now by something I read as adrenaline, which is apparently universal. The junction ahead opened onto the main maintenance artery, and the main artery was wide enough for 2 Type 7s side by side, and Ren pushed the motor to full as we came out of the tunnel and into the broader space. The artery ran east to west for nearly 2 kilometers, before it connected to the level 12 vehicle staging area and the decommissioned yard where we'd started. The Watcher response was faster than the tunnel units. Hear it. Or rather, I could hear what the hauler's frame was transmitting from outside. A deep subsonic vibration that I had never heard before, and that the girl had clearly heard before. Because when it started, she pressed further back and her wings folded in against her body so tightly that she seemed to become smaller. I recognized the frequency from Sophie's research notes. Watcher environmental scanners, running active instead of passive, which meant they were searching, not monitoring. Active scanning could locate a biological signature through vehicle shielding. They'll find her, I said. Friend said, I know. How far to the staging area? 1100 meter. How long does active scanning take to resolve a target? Sophie said 2 to 4 minutes for a fixed search pattern. We'll make it. He didn't sound uncertain. This was one of the things about Ren. He did not perform confidence in the theatrical way some officers did. The voice raised, the reassurance broad and designed to be heard. His certainty was practical. He had measured the variables and arrived at a conclusion, and he stated the conclusion. Sheen. Whether the conclusion was correct was a separate question from whether he believed it. We made it in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The decommissioned yard was as we'd left it. Empty, amber lit, the other retired vehicles sitting in their rows like a record of every decision the city had deferred. Ren brought the hauler to a stop in its original position. By the time he was out of the cab, the active scanning frequency had shifted. Still running, but the resolution pattern had changed, moving away from our section of the artery. The Watcher security units would be rerouting. We had a window. I didn't know how wide it was. The original plan had ended here. Get to the yard, abandon the vehicle, move through the civilian stacks with the girl, find somewhere safe to let her recover while we worked out next steps. It was not a complete plan. It had never been a complete plan. It had been the plan, as far as the planning had been able to go. The girl solved the problem of next steps herself. She stepped out of the cargo bay and looked up. The dome was visible from the yard. Level 12 was high enough in the stack that the upper infrastructure opened into the main civic cavity, and the dome was the ceiling of everything. That 2-kilometer arc of filtration panels and pressure glass, pink lit from within and dark from the surface side. She looked at it the way I had seen people look at it all my life without really seeing it. As a fact, as the top of the world, as the thing that was between here and the surface. Then she opened her wings. Not the tentative stabilizing adjustment I'd seen in the cargo bay, all the way open. Full span of them, in the amber light of the decommissioned yard, was something I was not prepared for, even after everything. Each wing easily 4 meters from shoulder to tip. The feathers catching the light and doing something with it that pure white feathers shouldn't be able to do, giving it back slightly altered, warmer, as if the feathers had an opinion about light and were expressing it. She stood with them open and looked up at the dome. And I understood, looking at her, that she had been thinking about the dome since the moment she woke up in the cargo bay, possibly since long before that. I said, the surface is irradiated. You can't. She looked at me, just looked. Disagreeing, not arguing. She didn't have language for argument, or at least not a language I shared. The look itself was very clear. It said, you don't know what I can and can't survive. You know what you can survive. That's a different question. She wasn't wrong. Ren said behind me, there's an emergency vent at the top of the civic cavity, north section. They use it for pressure equalization when the dome takes solar stress. It's sealed but not locked. The lock would defeat the emergency function. I looked at him. He shrugged slightly. Look at everything. The Watcher response hit the yard 11 seconds later. 2 security units through the eastern maintenance access. The subsonic scanner frequency rising to the register you feel in your back teeth. They came in fast, and they came in sure, and they came in too late by exactly the margin that Ren had calculated, which I suspected he had actually calculated and not simply hoped for. She was already 30 meters up. She had gone up the way birds go up, not straight, but in a long diagonal climb that used the space of the civic cavity efficiently. Her wings working in deep, even strokes. Her body angled into the ascent with a certainty of movement that told you this was not new, was not being relearned. was simply what she did when nothing was preventing her from doing it. The cavity was nearly 2 kilometers across and almost as tall in the center, and in it she was very small and very clear, white against the pink-lit dark, climbing, the wing struck so steady and unhurried. The Watcher security units stopped at the edge of the yard. I turned to look at them. The active scanner was still running. I could feel it, but the units themselves had stopped moving, and they were oriented upward, tracking her. And neither of them was deploying any kind of restraint or retrieval system. Tall one was there, the same one from the spire, or one indistinguishable from it, which in practice amounts to the same thing. It had come through a separate access point, the one reserved for Watcher senior personnel, and it stood at the boundary of the yard, with its 4 jointed arms at its sides, and it watched her climb. I walked over to it. I don't know why. Some quality of the moment, it felt like a conversation that needed finishing. I said, "She's going to the surface." "Yes," the Watcher said. "You're not going to stop her." There was a pause. The real kind this time, not the translation delay. An actual pause. The kind that means something is being considered. The specimen's surface tolerance is a matter of ongoing assessment, it said. Our model suggested a 12 to 18% surface viability without intervention. We had not yet completed the relevant protocols. I looked at it. You didn't know if she could survive up there. The data was incomplete, so you were keeping her down here, in a box, in the cold, until you finished your study. Another pause. Preservation protocol was a guess, I said. Guessing. And you didn't bother to ask her. And you didn't tell us. And you stood in that room and told me to step aside. The Watcher said nothing. Above us, the white shape had reached the level of the dome. The emergency vent in the north section was a seam in the filtration panels about 3 meters across, and I could see it from here as a slightly darker line against the pink. She found it the way she'd found everything, directly, without hesitation, as if she'd mapped the route from somewhere below and was simply completing it now. Sure, the vent opened. Not forced. It swung outward on its pressure relief hinges. Swung outward and let in a column of air from above. Surface air, which reached us down here 20 seconds later, as something sharp and cold, and unlike anything that had ever been processed through the dome's filtration system, carrying in it the smell of open sky. She went through. The vent swung closed behind her, the subsonic scanner frequency cut off. I stood in the silence of the decommissioned yard with Ren beside me, and the 2 Watcher security units at the perimeter, and the tall Watcher standing very still, looking at the closed vent in the dome. And I thought, 12 to 18% surface viability, according to their models. Their models, built from 10,000 years of managing species, of cataloging residents, of processing specimens through preservation protocols. Their models had not included the variable of what she was, because they didn't know what she was. They'd had her in a box, and they still didn't know, because the protocol for determining what something is, when you find it in a cultist's tower, is apparently to put it somewhere cold, and run your instruments at it and file your reports and wait for the data to clarify. They'd laughed, I thought. Not literally, the Watchers didn't laugh, but there is a kind of certainty that operates like laughter. The certainty that you understand a situation completely, that the variables are known, that the outcome is determined, that whatever the smaller thing in front of you might attempt has already been anticipated and accounted for. That certainty had been in the Spire room. It had been in the preservation archive. It had been in the translation caller's flat synthetic voice, telling me that classification was not within my authority to assign. The tall Watcher looked away from the dome and looked at me. Your actions were outside protocol, it said. Yes, I said. You caused significant disruption to an active stewardship preservation operation. Yes, you may be subject to a Accord compliance review. I thought about the girl going through the vent. I thought about the surface air reaching us cold and carrying the smell of open sky. I thought about the canteen and the careful sip and the look on her face when she decided to revise her model. View it, I said. The Watcher looked at me for a long moment with its horizontal slot, which was not a face, but which was doing something that felt, in that moment, like reassessment. Like a system running a variable it hadn't included in its original model and arriving at a result that didn't match the projected outcome. Then it turned and walked away with its security units, back through the eastern maintenance access, back into the infrastructure of a city it had been managing for 40 years with the assumption that management was the same thing as understanding. Ren and I stood there until the ambient scanner frequency had been gone long enough to be sure it wasn't coming back. Then he said, her viability was not 12 to 18%. No, I said. They knew that as soon as she went through the vent. I expect so. He looked up at where the vent was, closed now, just a line in the dome. She knew it too, he said. Yes, I said. She did. We walked out through the decommissioned yard, past the rows of retired vehicles, past the old drainage pumps and the electrical repair sleds and the Type 7 haulers that had been sitting there for years while the salvage allocation backlogged and the city did what the city did, and out into the level 12 maintenance corridor, and up through the stacks toward the surface of a world we hadn't breathed since before we were born. We never saw her again. I've looked in the years since. Not with instruments. I don't have instruments, and the Watcher scan data isn't shared with civilian personnel. Just looked at the dome. On clear days when the filtration panels run light, and the surface darkness above them seems less absolute, for a shape in it. A white shape, moving against the dark. I don't know if I'd be able to see it from down here. I don't know if she's still up there, or if she's gone somewhere further. Somewhere the radiation didn't follow, or the sun didn't reach, or the ceiling wasn't 2 kilometers of pressure glass and human fear. The Accord compliance review happened. Ren and I were suspended from duty for 90 days, which was the administrative equivalent of a shrug. They couldn't charge us under the Accord, because the Accord's legal provisions covered species classified as protected fauna, and the Watcher Review Board, in their final assessment, declined to classify the winged girl as protected fauna, on the grounds that their data on her was insufficient to support the classification. Insufficient data. They had run their instruments at her for 19 days, in a cold room, and they had insufficient data, because the data they needed was data they had given away, the moment we took her out of the containment unit and pointed her at the dome. The moment she went through that vent, she became something their models couldn't close the file on. She wasn't dead. She wasn't contained. She was outside the dome in a world their instruments had told them was 90-day lethal to a baseline human. And she was, as far as anyone could determine from the orbital monitoring they certainly ran after that night, not dying, which meant their 12 to 18% viability estimate was wrong, which meant their model was wrong, which meant the 19 days in the cold room had produced not data but the illusion of data, the comfortable fiction that observation is the same as understanding, couldn't charge us under the Accord for interfering with the preservation of a specimen that the Watchers themselves couldn't classify. The legal construction collapsed under its own logic. Oster sat across from me in the compliance interview and let the silence run for a while before he said, "The review board's finding is that no protected fauna status can be retroactively applied." He paused. The 90-day suspension stands for the vehicle damage and facility breach. Another pause. Pending your reinstatement, the precinct notes you are owed 12 personal days from last cycle. He looked at me. Don't come back before those are used. That was Oster. 29 years on the force. We served the 90 days. Ren painted the walls of his apartment a different color, fixed a leaking fitting in his kitchen sink, read 3 books he'd been meaning to read for years. I walked the civilian stacks more than I had in years. The parts of the city I didn't patrol, the residential levels in the middle stacks, where families lived, in the small apartments with their particular smell of cooking and recycled air, the commercial levels where the neon signs ran their rotations, the transit corridors where the city's ordinary motion was visible, people going places with things to carry, and reasons they didn't stop to examine, the city doing what the city did, under the dome, under the glow of the filtration panels, under the surface they had never seen and would probably never see. I looked up a lot during those 90 days. Ren went back to the stack beats after the suspension. He tended his spider plant. His daughter finished secondary school and went into the engineering corps. The city did what the city did. The dome filtered what it filtered. The panels cycled through their artificial days. I kept one thing from that night. Not a trophy, not a record. Just a thing I carry in the same place you carry the things you know to be true, without being able to fully explain them. She wasn't sure the offer was real. She drank anyway. That's what they never cataloged. That's what their models never held. The willingness to try the thing that might not be safe when the alternative is staying in the box. You can't scan for it. You can't preserve it in a cold room. You certainly can't determine a % viability for it in advance. You just have to watch what happens when the vent opens.